After Tiger King and Chimp Crazy, you may think you heard it all. Maybe enough to stop the abuse and cruelty of roadside zoos and their ilk. You would be wrong. Wait till you hear about the guy with the more than 300 animals, the arsenal of guns, drugs, and more than $1 million in cash. Next on the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On this episode, it took nearly 10 years, but finally, in June, the West Coast Game Park Safari in Oregon was finally shut down for its dozens of violations. It took PETA taking consumers' observations to state authorities, and when they took over, 310 animals were seized, and the owner, Brian Tenney, was arrested for drug possession, methamphetamines and coke, and found with an arsenal of 44 guns, including a gun modified to be a machine gun and a cannon. Authorities also found something that shows how successful the park was, more than $1 million in cash. Hard to say if the animals were a cover for the drugs or the drugs a side hustle with animals. But one thing for sure, the West Coast Game Park Safari was not kind to the animals, who were abused and endangered, essentially imprisoned all their lives. Debbie Metzler is the Senior Director of Captive Wildlife Legal and Corporate Affairs. My conversation with PETA's Debbie Metzler on the PETA Podcast with Emil Guillermo. Debbie, thank you for being here on the PETA Podcast. It's great to have you again.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I guess this is a big deal. The West Coast Game Park Safari in Oregon with 310 animals seized and all this other stuff that they found there. Why don't you explain, first of all, before we get into the details, define safari park. What is a safari park? What is a roadside zoo? Just so that people have in their mind, in their minds a place or, what these places are like.
Yeah, well, so roadside zoo essentially is any facility that exhibits animals that's not accredited. So there's accredited facilities by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the AZA, and those are the larger zoos that have, full-time veterinary staff, and they have higher standards for animal care that they provide beyond government requirements. And but the roadside zoos only have to comply with government requirements. And even then, as we'll talk about more with the West Coast Game Park, they don't always comply with those very minimum requirements. The other accrediting body that's reputable is the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. So those groups are the ones to look for if you're interested in going to something that has safari in the name, safari park. If it's not accredited, they just have slap that name on as a way to appeal to the public. Some of them even call themselves sanctuaries. Anyone can put that name on their business, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually a sanctuary. So you have to do a little bit more digging, and PETA does have a resource about how to tell the difference between like a pseudo sanctuary and a real sanctuary. This roadside zoo that we're talking about today I can say past tense now because it is closed. It was literally on the side of the road. So it's like the definition of a roadside zoo.
But Debbie, I guess the point is if an entity is not accredited, it means it opens up, they're not necessarily illegal, but it opens up all of these kind of unethical, cruel practices that aren't regulated, that aren't that there's no oversight, right? I mean, is that really why we should be concerned about these folks?
Yeah, so there's no extra check boxes that they're filling out. If there's an alliance or an accrediting body that has certain standards that have to be met, and they review those every few years, if not more often. And if you fall out of compliance, then you lose that accreditation or you lose that alliance membership. With the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture license that's required for facilities to exhibit animals. They just rubber stamp these licenses if they, they pay their fees and they are in compliance with the regulations just before they receive their license, which is, those inspections are scheduled when it comes time for them to renew their license, so they can clean up and make sure that they're meeting the minimum requirements, and then they just get their license. They actually have 3 chances. So if the inspectors come out and they find some issues, they get cited, they have 2 more chances to come into compliance before they get their license. So almost everyone gets a license. It's really not that difficult to get the exhibitor's license from the USDA. And then after that, they have the ability to do business legally. But even if they are not complying with the regulations, they don't necessarily get their license stripped away. So West Coast Game Park in the last year had 80 citations from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I mean, it included things like animals who were very thin, their bones were showing, and animals had died. And they still have a license. They actually, to this day, still have a license. USDA has still not taken away their license, even though they've closed down, because the state went in and based on those citations from the USDA, they were able to seize animals under allegations of felony animal neglect.
People might have in mind a place like what they saw in Tiger King or what they saw in the Chimp Crazy documentaries on HBO. I mean, this is the kind of world we're dealing in, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is exactly like a facility that was featured in Tiger King, the GW Exotic Animal Park that was run by Joe Exotic. And this is very similar, super rundown, really overcrowded with animals. Staff don't necessarily know what's best for them, and they have a shoestring budget. So they are, really neglecting the animals. And that's what PETA went to the state with a stack of evidence. We pulled from the USDA's inspection reports to show that this is happening. The federal government is finding these issues. But also, we had footage that was very damning. I myself had visited this facility, and some of my other colleagues, and then also we received a lot of complaints from the public. And we took all that evidence to the state, and they started an investigation. And in their search warrant affidavit, it actually did acknowledge that PETA's complaints played a major role in igniting the action. So they received the complaints from PETA, looked into it, and under their own investigation, determined that the animals needed to be seized.
Well, Debbie, tell me, what exactly did you find when you investigated, and then what was then uncovered by the state's investigation?
Well, so the state's investigation is still ongoing. So there's a lot that we don't know yet about what they have specifically found and what we do expect them to press charges against the owner for animal neglect and cruelty. But that has not happened yet because they are still building their case. And part of that case is that, once the animals are in safety, they get evaluated by veterinarians. They're able to essentially tell what these animals have been suffering from. And that actually does help build their case. And so it is ongoing. And there's a lot that the facilities who have taken these animals can't talk about. It's still pretty limited information that we have, but we can assume that a lot of what we found is what they also found. So, there was a solitary chimpanzee. His name was George, and he was living in complete isolation. He had plucked out a lot of his hair because he would just sit there and pluck his hair, which is something they do when they're bored. And he would also try to get attention from people visiting. So he would blow raspberries with his lips. And he just kind of did that constantly. And it was, it's one thing if they do it briefly just to get some attention, if there's something that they want from a caregiver or something like that. But when it is constant, which is what George was doing, he would just sit there blowing raspberries, picking his hair. And we would see this in footage from complainants. We'd see it on social media. It was just what he did all the time.
He wasn't blowing raspberries to blow raspberries. He wasn't happy.
Yeah, well, I mean, he didn't have anything to do. There was a climbing structure, but he didn't really have any enrichment. There were, a few hanging barrels or something like that for him to climb on. They were there all the time. It never changed. And so chimpanzees are extremely, they're very social animals. They're very complex animals, and they require a lot of mental stimulation. And he didn't have that. And then other things that I witnessed personally, and then also complainants mentioned, were just really rundown facilities. So you'd be walking through this safari park. There were a lot of deer. There were farmed animals like goats and llamas and donkeys who were just wandering around the facility, and no one was necessarily monitoring them. Guests were allowed to feed them, and so no one was monitoring how much they were being fed or how little they were being fed. They also were defecating and urinating all over the park, and so people are sludging through animal filth, and then the animals are also getting it on themselves. It's building up in puddles around the facility there, so there were a lot of water sanitation issues. And then the big cats were held in these really barren cages that just had gravel and not much else. And they were pacing back and forth, which is also a sign of psychological distress. The bears were kept in a really barren enclosure which was just filled with mud. It rains a lot in Oregon, so they didn't have proper drainage. It just was really evident that a lot of issues were persistent throughout the facility, and we would see the same issues over and over again. So that's what we took as evidence to the state. So they did seize over 300 animals. Initial reports were 310, but then the Oregon Humane Society revealed later that it was 322 in all. So I believe that there were some probably free-roaming cats and chickens who they later rescued after that.
This isn't exactly the normal situation for a deer to find a chicken, to find a couple of tigers and bears. I mean, it doesn't sound like a very natural situation for the animals, let alone maybe a very unhygienic and decrepit type of a situation.
Absolutely not. And this facility also did cub petting and photo ops with wild animals. So for years, they would have infant big cats, and they would have infant bear cubs that you could come and hold and take a photo of. And people would post that on social media, and they thought it was cute. But this is obviously a very miserable existence for these animals. They've been torn from their mothers. PETA has proven in court that tearing big cats from their mothers and using them in photo op encounters does violate the Endangered Species Act. And then also in late 2022, the Big Cat Public Safety Act was passed, which then made those kinds of encounters illegal. However, that didn't stop the West Coast Game Park. They still decided to go forth with using a jaguar in encounters despite the new law. And then they actually were using that big cat when he was far too big to be considered acceptable by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, because the USDA doesn't prohibit photo ops with wild animals, but they do advise that there's a certain age range in which can be used, but after that, they're just too big and too dangerous. Obviously, PETA would argue that it's never okay at any age, but this jaguar was being used in violation of both USDA guidelines and also the Big Cat Public Safety Act. So West Coast Game Park did get warned about that from multiple agencies. They got, a slap on the wrist, essentially. So they stopped using big cats, but they pivoted and they started using a serval. When I was there, they were using a serval who I believe they said was like a year and a half old. So, this is, yes, a smaller wildcat, but they can still inflict damage on humans. And even while I was there taking photos and video of one of the encounters, the guests were commenting on how the serval was biting them. The serval is an African cat. They're a wild cat. They're smaller than a cheetah, bigger than your domestic house cat.
Yeah. So, but it sounds like, just as you described this place, it does bring back images of Tiger King and Chimp Crazy, and they were just allowed to run sort of under the radar until people started complaining. It also suggests a kind of a culty thing where there's a culture that usually has some kind of, there's drugs and firearms. And certainly that was proven in the case of this safari park. They found those things. So tell me about that.
During the seizure, they confiscated the over 300 animals and they found 44 firearms, including a cannon and one gun that had been modified into a machine gun. And they found 80 grams of methamphetamine and 8 grams of cocaine. And then they also found over 1.5 or $1.6 million in cash and bonds. And so this owner was sitting on a pile of drugs, a pile of guns, a pile of money. And none of that money and none of what he was, doing on the side was in any way supporting the animals. They were starving and living in filth. And so obviously, he did not prioritize animals in any way, shape, or form. He was selling drugs and doing a lot of nefarious things. So he was arrested, and he will definitely be facing consequences for not only what he did to the animals, but also for these other drug-related charges.
It was kind of a surprise to find the drugs and the firearms and the cash, over $1 million in cash.
Yeah, that part is really shocking, given how run down the facility was, that he was just sitting on over $1 million. Obviously, did not care about the animals and their welfare. Because the investigation is ongoing, we don't know where all of the animals have ended up, but authorities have assured that they are all in reputable, licensed and many of them accredited facilities. And this story does become a little personal for me because, like I said, I've been there. I've met George, the chimpanzee. He was rescued by a chimpanzee sanctuary that I used to work at. So it kind of comes full circle for me. And actually, that chimpanzee sanctuary, their first group of chimpanzees, most of whom are still living there, were found in a 1994 PETA investigation of a laboratory. They were found in a windowless basement of Buckshire Corporation in Pennsylvania. So, it's a small world, but I have definitely come full circle, working at a chimpanzee sanctuary whose residents were found by PETA. And now, I'm working with PETA and an animal who was rescued largely in part because of work that we did is at the sanctuary I used to work at. So,
yeah, tell me about the status of the park. It's permanently closed now, but the license is still there. So could the owner,
Well, so we don't know yet if it's permanently closed. So it is closed. The animals are gone. But while the case is ongoing, I think any permanent status is sort of up in the air unless the owner makes it clear that it is shut down for good. And like I said, they still do have a license. However, that license is up for renewal in July, I believe. And so when the USDA, goes to start the renewal process, I can't imagine that they will grant the license because the facility is closed and has no animals. So once it doesn't have a license, I think, we're closer to that step of closing it for good. But for now, the animals are safe. And that's what's most important. And we do expect to see charges. And PETA will be monitoring really closely and providing whatever evidence it can to support the case and make sure that the animals stay in the safe homes that they're currently in.
And so it's not just the animal charges, but I assume there will be charges on the drugs and the firearms found.
Yeah, he was arrested. So there are charges related to the guns and the drugs.
Here's the thing. Throughout all this, the park was open. People were there. You went there. You were filming. People were upset when they saw the situation with the animals, and they went to PETA. I suppose that's really how your group within PETA finds out about these things, because people are unsuspecting consumers and they go to these roadside zoos and they're appalled. And so that is really what people should do. When you see something like this, say something, which means call up PETA.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we encourage people to not attend roadside zoos, and we try to educate the public to, make decisions that help the animals, which means not giving money to facilities that are abusing them, obviously. But sometimes people find themselves at these facilities for one reason or another. A family is going there, they end up on a school field trip or something like that. And or maybe they just didn't understand the cruelty involved in keeping animals in really rundown cages. And so once they are there, definitely snap some photos, take note of issues that you see. And there's actually a short URL for a page that goes straight to the complaint form that goes into my department, and that's PETA.org/abuse. And you just go to that and it takes you straight to the form where you can fill out information about what you may have seen. And like I said, it's always good to take photos and videos of what you saw. And in many cases, we might already have ongoing efforts for a facility that we can then tell the complainant about, and we can make sure that they tell their friends and family, and they take action on their action alerts and that kind of thing. But every once in a while, they are tipping us off to a place. And it never ceases to amaze me, the fact that even though we track thousands of facilities, there are new ones that open up, or there's ones that have kind of been under the radar. For instance, in Pennsylvania, there was a hunting club, and the hunting club had in the back a wildlife menagerie. It included this bear named Dylan, who was living on concrete, and he was extremely morbidly obese, and he was just fed restaurant scraps, and he would sway his head in distress. And the people attending the hunting club and going to the restaurant, they're not going to report this to PETA. So it was under our radar until someone decided they needed to say something, because as much as they might not align with PETA on all issues, this is one issue that they could not let slide. And we found that too, especially with Tiger King and Chimp Crazy. It seems to be kind of like a gateway issue for PETA. So people will say, I don't agree with PETA on everything, but I agree with them on this. We can't do this to animals. And so then once they start looking into it, I think they realize that they actually do agree with PETA on most things.
Yeah, it's interesting because, all right, so as we wrap up, this is how PETA knows about these things. Either they stumble upon these, you track, of course, but people can find them, and then they come on your radar, and then you see just how bad this thing or a certain situation is. But as we wrap up, tell me about the significance of West Coast Game Park Safari in particular, with this 310 animals seized and the owner arrested for drug possession, and you've got the firearms issues. Where does this fall in line with what PETA finds, and how PETA can about the situation out there in the roadside zoo landscape?
Yeah, well, I think, every single bad actor and player that goes down is just a sign to other facilities that the writing's on the wall. And this is not something that the public will stand for, and it's certainly not something that PETA will allow to go on.
Debbie Metzler, Senior Director of Captive, Wildlife, Legal and Corporate Affairs for the PETA Foundation. The case is still ongoing, but the animals are safe. We'll follow up as more is known about the West Coast Game Park Safari, but know this: the park couldn't have been exposed without your help. Go to PETA.org/abuse. That's PETA.org/abuse. And report things you've seen at roadside zoos and parks, and help out people like Debbie at PETA try to shut them down. Go to PETA.org/abuse. Once again, thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. You can contact me at PETA.org, or find me on X at Twitter at Emil Amok, EMILAMOK, or see me at AMOK.com, or find this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. Once again, thank you. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. Give it 4 stars, 5 stars. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.